Been working our way in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 5 today, if you want to turn there and follow along. We're going through a series called The Kingdom of Heaven. That's the whole entirety of Matthew's Gospel. That's kind of a theme that we see spread throughout all of it. And last week we started a mini-series within the series that's been titled Kingdom Life. As we jump into the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus describes what does life in the kingdom look like. And last week we kind of did an overview of the Sermon on the Mount. We looked at how does it fit into the larger picture of Matthew's Gospel. What are some themes that we can trace throughout the entire sermon? And then we kind of honed in on the first part of the Beatitudes, but looking at them as a whole. And today we're going to dive deeper into them. And look at kind of them as groups or more individually. Some people take an entire sermon for every beatitude. That would take quite a while, and though I believe it would be worthy of doing so, we're not going to do that while we're trying to get through the entire gospel together, but may another time work through it in that way. So we're going to look at the kingdom of righteous flourishing. There's some themes that you may remember from last week of the entire sermon, but we're going to see how they show up today. Thinking of flourishing, I was looking up online, what is the number one education system in the world? Anybody know what it is? Now, it depends on which website you go to, but a few different websites had Denmark listed as the number one education system in the world. This is quite interesting, though, because Denmark has become this highly rated education system by rejecting some of the very things that the rest of the education systems do. The Denmark system refuses to do formal standardized testing and refuses to have class rankings for their students. So it's interesting that by coming to the end of what the world's standards are, and now looking at these students as human beings and developing actually more skills and more relational ideas with them. By doing those things, they've actually begun to flourish better than all of those walking in these other worldly kind of standards. And that's kind of what we see as a theme today. That as Jesus ushers in the kingdom of heaven, he brings righteous flourishing. But in order for us to experience righteous flourishing, we must come to the end of everything the world thought would make us flourish. We must reject everything that we think, at least in the world's ideas, that will help us to be happy. We have to reject all of those and actually take a very different route, one that most would consider to be a downward route, to actually find ourselves flourishing upward. So we read it last week, but we're going to read it again. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Seeing the crowds, he, Jesus, went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now hopefully you remember some pieces of last week talking about righteousness being a theme of the entire sermon, and we see that pop up a couple different times here. Also, we talk about the idea of the word blessed. And we have to understand that rightly, that that's not this kind of exchange, right? Like obey and you get this specific blessing, this specific gift. That's not what he's talking about. The word blessed here could maybe better be translated as happy, as long as happiness isn't determined by external circumstances. It's this well-being of the soul. You might think about shalom or the word flourishing, right? Like, how do you have this inner peace, this inner flourishing being experienced in life, no matter what is going on around you? And now, as we look through all of these, Jesus' word choice is not random by any means. If you are familiar with the Old Testament, there's a passage in Isaiah 61 that Jesus actually claims to be true about himself elsewhere in the Gospels, talking about the Spirit of the Lord coming upon him. And then he goes on to explain what that means. Isaiah 61 talks about some of these ideas, that the poor will have the good news preached to them. Those who are mourning will be comforted. And concepts of righteousness and this idea of rejoice because this new kingdom has come. So as Jesus begins the Beatitudes here, he's giving a hint that what was promised in Isaiah 61 is actually coming to fulfillment in the kingdom that he is bringing. But he doesn't just give a direct quote from Isaiah 61, like we've seen Matthew do time and time again already in his gospel, where it says, well, this fulfills this. He doesn't give that. Instead, Jesus organizes all these truths from Isaiah 61 and elsewhere in the Old Testament. He reorganizes all of them in a structure for us to help us see what this flourishing path really looks like. He doesn't randomly choose which beatitude comes first. In fact, we're going to see kind of the flow of that as we work through it this morning. So you can see it kind of if you just have the outline of the sermon there. We're going to look at the first three Beatitudes together. Then we're going to look at one, and then the next three, and then one. And the reason we're doing those ones individually is because both of those ones have the word righteousness in them. And so there seems to be this theme that Matthew or Jesus is trying to portray for us here. So righteousness is a key element that we have to pay close attention to. So we're going to begin by looking at the first three together. Particularly, these first three are a contemplation of our own hearts. Particularly, what does your heart look like without Jesus? And so thus you can see how we got to the first point. We are to mourn the absence of righteousness in ourselves. First, in verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit. This is key. If we don't understand this one, we're never going to understand the flow of the rest of them. And this is often a misunderstood one. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? We know what it means to be poor, but what does it mean to be poor in spirit? So consider the opposite. How would you describe someone who's rich in spirit? You'd probably consider them to be arrogant, prideful, full of self-love, thinking they're self-sufficient in and of themselves. Essentially, all the qualities that our world tells us we should pursue, right? And yet here, Jesus says, those who get the kingdom is everybody who's not like that. Everybody who rejects all of those ideas of self-love and pride. Instead, it's those who realize that in their spirits, in their hearts, they have poverty. That our hearts, apart from Jesus, have nothing of value in them. Because all they have is sin and death. So we have to really come to this contemplation of, without Jesus, we are poor. And it takes Jesus himself, the Holy Spirit working in us, to help us to see that. The truth is, all of us, all of mankind is poor in spirit no matter what. Right? Left to ourselves, none of us have anything to offer, but we only see that for ourselves by God's help, by the Spirit revealing that to us. Right? And it's only then that we can actually begin to pursue a righteous or a flourishing life, when we recognize how lacking we are in righteousness when left to ourselves. Think of it kind of like people in our world who like to live on credit. Right? These people like to live like they're rich, right? Like to swipe the card and keep buying all of these luxuries of life as if they're rich. Yet one day, the bill comes due. And you recognize how poor you really are, even though you've been trying to live like someone who's rich. And this is telling us you will never flourish until you actually recognize and confess your own poverty. So my friends, some of you maybe just need to consider that this morning. Are you poor in spirit? Do you recognize that? Do you confess that? That you see your own poverty if left to yourself? Because only when you fully see it will you be able to now step into the next beatitude, which says, blessed are those who mourn. This isn't just random mourning, right? This is you're mourning what you just realized about being poor in spirit. You're grieving your own inability to get to God on your own, right? So this isn't just about being poor financially and grieving that you have no financial security. This is realizing that your heart, your spirit is destitute if left to itself. And when you realize that truth, it breaks us down. It should. It brings us to the point of actually being grieved and mourned and saddened by our state of our hearts. So when we think of poor in spirit, we also shouldn't think of this as a sort of false humility, right? When we say poor in spirit, it doesn't mean you have to vocalize it to everybody that you meet, right? Oh, I'm just such a dumb person, or I'm so ugly, right? Like, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about poor in spirit. That's false humility. In fact, that's pride, right? That's you taking your own view of yourself and promoting it, right? So that's not what we mean by being poor in spirit. What we mean is to be truly poor is to see the lowliness of yourself and to grieve it. But that also doesn't take you to a point of being in despair. It doesn't take you to the point of feeling worthless. It doesn't take you to the point of feeling like there's no hope in the world, because what's it say? Those who mourn their poverty in spirit, what do they get to experience? They shall be comforted. Right? So it's not a place of despair. It's not a place of worthlessness. It's a place of saying, I'm lowly, but God gives me comfort in my mourning of my lowliness. God actually desires for you to be brokenhearted about yourself. And that's where he can come and comfort you. So the question is not just, do you see your poverty in spirit, but has that sight, that understanding of your poverty led you to an actual mourning over it? Only by those two steps do we reach the third one, which is us coming to the complete end of ourselves. It generates a heart that is meek. Blessed are the meek. Now that's a word we easily misunderstand. Our world likes to view this word meek, and it's infiltrated into our minds that this means you're a doormat of sorts. That you just let people walk all over you, right? It's like, well, that's what Jesus means when he says turn the other cheek, right? That you just let people walk all over you and you're weak and you don't have a spine, all of that sort of stuff. But that's not necessarily true, because in Matthew chapter 11, many of you are familiar with this verse, right? Matthew 11, 28 and 29, Jesus says, right? Come to me, all you who are heavy laden and burdened, and I will give you rest. And he says, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. It also could be translated, for I am meek and lowly in heart. It's the same word that's used in the Beatitudes. And so Jesus says, you have a heavy burden, come give it to me. That's not weakness. That's not someone who's a coward. That's not someone just letting people walk all over him. That's him saying, no, I have strength to carry your heavy burden for you. Instead, we ought to view meekness as a resistance of championing ourselves, a resistance of self-exaltation. Christ lowers himself to help others, right? He empties himself, but he doesn't get to the point of being a doormat, right? So we see all three of these are true in Christ. Though he isn't a sinner, he enters a state of poverty in order to help us. And he looks around him and he grieves the poverty around him. He weeps over the unbelief of the people that exist around him. And he still refrains from exalting himself. If anyone was deserving to exalt himself, it was Christ, and he resisted that. Right? So that's true of us. Those of us who realize our poverty in spirit and mourn that poverty of spirit come to the end of ourselves, that we refuse to champion ourselves over other people. So we're not looking when somebody hurts us, we're not looking to exalt ourselves over them by getting revenge, right? That's not what meekness is. Meekness is the opposite of that, saying, I don't feel the need to push back on you and exalt myself. Or it's not a self-exaltation of, I must have the world praising me and looking at me. I don't really care what the rest of the world is saying about me, right? I'm not trying to champion myself because I recognize what's in myself left to my own. And so we can respond to the world with gentleness and with goodness, even to the people who are seeking to harm us, because we look at those people and say, guess what? They're poor in spirit just like I am. They just may not have realized it yet. And so we hold all three of these pieces in tandem with each other. We can't isolate one from the other. So we consider without Jesus, we have no righteousness. We bring nothing to the table. And then we mourn that reality. And we come to the end of ourselves, and now we begin to view the world around us as everybody is poor in spirit. They just don't all realize it. Only when we begin to have that view of ourselves, only when we begin to have that heart produced within us, will we actually see the things that are promised. Only then do we receive the kingdom. Only then do we experience comfort. Only then do we have the promise to be the ones who will inherit the earth. Think of it kind of like a seed, right? If a seed is on a tree of sorts, that seed has to abandon the comfort, right, of what that tree gives it in order to fall and find true life for itself. And so it's the same for us. We must abandon all the hopes of being rich in spirit on our own. We must abandon all the attempts at comfort for our hearts on our own. And we must lessen, right, lower ourselves, recognize how truly lifeless we are if we actually want to flourish and have true life exist within us. Only by our own poverty and coming to the end of ourselves do we actually get to walk in the kingdom of heaven that Jesus brings in. So just pause for a moment after those three and say, am I there? Is that me right now? Have I recognized my poverty? Has it brought me to mourning? And has it brought me to a meekness saying, I'm going to refuse to champion myself? Have you seen the depths of your poverty and mourned them? You see, because it's only when we realize what we're lacking that we then can turn and see what we must be chasing after. Only when we realize the absence will we see our true need, which is really what we turn to now in the fourth beatitude. And it's kind of this core beatitude. Like I said, it has the word righteousness in it. And it tells us that when you lack righteousness in your spirit, guess what you start to hunger for? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. You recognize you don't have it, so now you begin to hunger and thirst to have it within you. Now we have to understand the word righteousness here. Most of the time, we think of the word righteousness in the way that Paul uses it. And that's right, because it's used in that way, right? We think of Paul uses it in a very legal way, saying that by faith, Christ has gifted you his righteousness. So now God looks at you and declares you to be righteous before the judge. Right? And that's true. That's wholeheartedly true. It's in the book of Romans through and through. We can't deny that reality. But we have to ask the question, is Matthew using that word in the same way in his gospel? Matthew and Paul are not the same person. Is this Matthew's idea that it's just Christ gives you righteousness and that's all? That's it? God looks at you and calls you righteous? Then what's it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness then? And that's where the rest of the sermon comes in helpful. And we touched on this a little bit last week. In chapter 5, verse 20, right within the same chapter, Jesus is going to tell all of these people listening, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees if you want the kingdom. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he's going to go on through the rest of chapter 5 and give examples of how the Pharisees, or the Jews in general, tried to find righteousness by following the law. Just saying, okay, don't murder, right? Okay, don't commit adultery, right? All these external things, as long as you obey. And yet Jesus is going to say, no, you've missed it. It's actually a righteousness that begins in your heart. It's not about just committing adultery. It's about looking at someone with lust. It's not just about murdering someone. It's about having anger towards someone. And in fact, that's exactly what Jesus is going to condemn, essentially, the Pharisees for. In Matthew 23, we're going to see some very similar language just on the opposite end. We see all the blessings or the Beatitudes here. In Matthew 23, we have all the woes to the religious leaders. And I'm going to just read two of them to you here. Matthew 23, verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So did you hear it? What Jesus is trying to point at in the whole Gospel of Matthew, what righteousness looks like, is not just this Christ gifts you his righteousness, that's true, but this pursuit of us to be inwardly righteous, so that then we would display it outwardly. And that fits perfectly with everything we've just seen in the Beatitudes, saying you are poor in spirit, meaning you don't have righteousness in your spirit, so now you hunger and thirst for that righteousness to happen within you. Right? There's this desperation language here, right? To be hungry, to be thirsty, to be starving without it. So our greatest need is that we would be righteous inside, then out. And then notice, for those who want that, they shall be satisfied. The only way that you're actually satisfied by having righteousness in you is when you want that righteousness in the first place. And the reality is, we will never want that righteousness without the Spirit stirring that desire in us in the first place. But when you truly are thirsty for it, that's when you begin to actually experience it. And Jesus is saying here, this is what a flourishing life wants. That you want Christ to cleanse you, to renew you within, that you actually want your wants to change, so then you can live your life differently. And when you actually find yourself wanting this kind of righteousness, that's when you truly find it. So just ask yourself the question, what do I most deeply hunger for in life? And if it's not a heart of righteousness, you're going to be unsatisfied. You're not going to feel happy. You're not going to be flourishing until you actually want what you really need, which is for your heart to be made righteous. Think of it kind of like, I'm sure none of you men have ever experienced this, right? Where you buy flowers for your wife because she told you to buy flowers for her. How well does that go over? Usually not very well, at least in my experience, right? It doesn't go over well because she doesn't want you to do it because she told you you should do it. She wants you to do it because you want to do it. Right? Am I right, ladies? Yes. Friends, it's no different. God doesn't want you to just do it because he told you to. He wants you to want to do it. He wants you to want righteousness, not just to perform it. And it's only when you truly want it that you will actually find yourself satisfied with it. Now, once we get there, if righteousness actually becomes our hunger, our desire, we actually will begin to walk in that righteousness. We will begin to radiate a righteous life. And that's what the next set of 3 Beatitudes describes for us. What does that righteous life look like? What does that flourishing life look like, flowing from a righteous heart? So the 5th one, verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Now, if you follow that word throughout the Gospels, even just the Gospel of Matthew, you're going to see people who are in miserable states crying out for Jesus, have mercy on me. And so essentially, when we think about mercy, we're thinking about people who are in a miserable state. People who are at the end of their misery and are just calling out for someone to give them a little bit of grace, a little bit of mercy. But we need to remember, while it's true that all of these sick people who are calling for Jesus to have mercy on me, there's no deeper misery than for someone to be poor in spirit. And particularly someone to be poor in spirit and to not realize that they're poor in spirit. There's no misery deeper than that. And so, how do we interact with people who are in that state? You are to be merciful. Right? So think of this, we'll see this later in the Sermon on the Mount, right? You look at that person and you don't say, they have a log in their eye, I have a speck in mine. Instead, you say, I need to worry about the log in my own before I even touch their speck. Because if you notice something, this is the only beatitude where the same word is used twice. Blessed are you who give mercy, for you will be the ones who receive mercy. It essentially is saying, you look at other people around you and say, they have the same need that I do. They are poor in spirit just like I am, so I now want to give them the mercy that God has given me. And we must not misunderstand this. This is not a works-based salvation here. Right? That's the temptation, isn't it? I must give mercy if I really want to receive mercy on that last day. But that's only taking it at surface value. If we actually understand the whole picture of Matthew, the whole picture of the New Testament, the point is, God has already given you mercy. Thus now you should extend that to others. And if you let his mercy flow through you to extend it to others, you will prove on that last day that you will be receivers of the fullness of mercy by getting the full kingdom of heaven. Right? So it's essentially saying, I first am a mercy receiver, which now causes me to be a mercy giver, and on that final day, I will be another mercy receiver in its fullness. And so we look around, right? This is now interacting with the world. From someone who has a righteous heart, we look and we treat others the way that Christ has treated us. Christ looked at us and said, they're poor in spirit. I'm going to become poor in order to help them. And so we look at these people and say, they're not any worse. They're just as poor in spirit as I am. And so let me show mercy. So that's the first quality. Second quality that radiates from a righteous heart is another inside-out experience. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart. Now clearly you must think, we heard spirit before, we're hearing heart now. This begins as an inward experience. Right? We all recognize we have impurities in our hearts that need to be refined. Right? Kind of think, I know some of you do this, right? When you're cutting a deer and hair gets on the deer, right? You take the blowtorch and burn off some of the hair, right? Some of the things that would be impure in the meat, right? You burn it off. All of our hearts need that. All of our hearts have impurities within them that need burned out of us. But we also recognize that what we allow to exist outside of ourselves influences our hearts into impure or pure ways. And so now it's saying if you want to truly flourish in life, you must care about your holiness. Because guess what? God cares about your holiness. God cares about your purity. In fact, just consider for a moment, I've been reading through it this week. In Exodus, I've been reading through all the different things that needed to happen in order for the priests to get to the holy place. right? And not even the most holy place, right? We're not talking about the Holy of Holies. Just for them to enter the tent. All of the things that had to happen for them to be declared, quote unquote, holy, just to be near God's presence. Not even to be on the other side of the curtain and in God's presence, just to be near God's presence. All of these things that had to make them pure, that had to make them clean from all the things that they had done, from all the sin, from all the uncleanliness ways that they had. And so it makes sense for us that it says here, they shall see God, only those who are pure in heart. You only get to have God, see God on that final day, right? You only get to have the relationship if you are being made pure. Nothing impure can be in his presence. So you need that pureness of heart. So now we desire that, right? We chase after that in the world. We are careful to protect ourselves of that which would make us impure. Just the second quality, and the third one there in verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Notice, peacemakers, not peacekeepers. We're not talking about those who avoid conflict. We're not talking about those who never address the offenses that happen, but rather those who seek reconciliation when the offenses have occurred. That's exactly what will happen later on in Matthew 5:23. Jesus will say, if you're offering your gift at the altar and realize that there's something between you and your brother, go reconcile with him before you ever make your gift at the altar. Right? He doesn't say, act like the offense never happened. He says, you must clarify, right? You must go and address the offense and make peace with that person, reconcile with that person. And so if we want to truly flourish, we have to address the offense, but we seek peace in the midst of addressing that offense. Because that's exactly what God does for us. God doesn't just say, yeah, they sinned, they offended me. God says, I'm sending my son to address the offense so that they might have peace with me. And so now it says, we do the same gesture. We make peace with the people around us, and only by doing so do people recognize us, or do we experience what it means to be sons of God. So these are just three qualities of a righteous heart that flows into life. So you think of a little bit like, I use the word radiate for a purpose, right? Think of it like a candle. And in fact, what are we going to see next week, right, is you don't take a lamp and hide it under a basket, right? A candle spreads or shows its light. Light and heat radiates from a candle. And this is saying righteousness in someone's heart radiates into how they interact with the rest of the world. And that's what true flourishing looks like from the inside out. And so those three radiations named here are being merciful, being pure, and being peacemakers. Or you might just say Christ-like qualities. All the things that Jesus himself does. So just take those three from this morning and consider, is there any of these lacking in radiation from my life? Do I seem to lack some sort of mercy for others? Or, as Peggy was just talking about, love for others, the very similar concepts in those. Am I lacking in protecting myself from impure things? Am I lacking in my pursuit of making peace with those who have offended me or those I have offended? And then meditate on the fact that all of that flows from a heart that is not fully righteous, because a righteous heart radiates those things. So ponder where in your heart has gone wrong that you wouldn't want to pursue these things of a righteous life. Now, this all sounds wonderful, doesn't it? If only it were that easy to produce all of these things, right? And in producing them, to have a world that would actually love to see these things, but we don't. We don't live in a world that enjoys righteous hearts and righteous living. And that's where the final words come in here in verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Did you hear it? People will hate this righteousness. People will hate it. People will revile it. They'll utter all sorts of evil against it. They'll lie about you as you pursue it, just like they did to all the prophets. They rejected it in the Old Testament. The kingdom of earth, the kingdom of darkness, hates the kingdom of Christ. But, hopefully you heard in these verses, even while you're pursuing it and the world hates you because of it, you can flourish. How? By recognizing that you have a reward that is better than the world. Just recognize everything that we've seen so far. Right? All the things in the second half of these Beatitudes, all of those get to be yours now. You get to have a taste of them now. And on that final day, you get the fullness of all of those things. We must begin to see those things as a better reward, right? Those things are vastly more precious than anything the world could offer us. So you can be mocked, ridiculed, wounded even, and yet flourish because you know the kingdom is yours. So my friends, knowing you have that kingdom, you can do what it says. The only real commands in this entire passage, verse 12, rejoice and be glad. Right? So when you mourn your poverty, when you begin to hunger for righteousness and then begin to radiate that righteousness, that Christ-likeness in your life, you can be sure of this. You will have comfort. You will be given the promise to be an inheritor of the earth. You will be satisfied. You will receive mercy. You will see God, and he will call you his own. So if this is you this morning, if you are experiencing these first levels of this kingdom, leading into righteous hearts and righteous living, if this is you, my friends, rejoice and be glad, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Let's pray.